Wind fretted the top of the wall the way a mother frets over a feverish child, stroking and scolding, tugging at hair and cloak, testing every weakness. It found chinks in black wool and leaked its thin knives down Jon Snow's neck. Far below, Castle Black crouched with the patience of old bones. Beyond, the haunted forest stretched in serried ranks of dark pines and bare-limbed weirwoods, a sea of winter that swallowed shape and distance. Ghost moved at his knee like a pale shadow, pads silent against rime, eyes like coals banked under ash. He had learned a long time ago that the wall had voices. It creaked inside and hummed in the night. Sometimes it popped loud as a mast under strain. Sometimes it spoke in a low drone that set a man's teeth on edge if he listened over long. Tonight it sounded tired, and Jon could not shake the thought that walls could be tired the same as men. He rested his gloved hand on the ice and felt a cold older than oaths. Still here, he told the darkness. So are we. The wind stole his breath and returned it tasting of salt and the ghost of pine smoke. Behind him, the winch house lamps threw saffron bars across the ice. From their warmth came the faint clank of chains, a cough, the murmur of stewards playing at tiles on a crate, and the scratch of satin-soft quill on parchment where Clydas, wrapped in 3 scarves and a blanket that had once been blue, copied the same words again and again until they would be ravens' mouths. Under Jon's glove, Ghost pressed his skull to the ice with a rough affection that made Jon smile despite himself. "I hear you," Jon said softly, though he could not have said whether he meant wolf or wall or winter. "I will try." He had promised too many people too many things since the day the old bear's raven had flown away into a storm with the black-feathered note of Jeor Mormont's death hooked to its leg. He had promised old gods and new. He had promised a king with smoke for a crown and a queen whose eyes measured him the way a seamstress measures cloth. He had promised men who smelled of salt and men who smelled of earth and men who smelled of iron, and he had made quiet promises to the dead, which were the easiest promises to make and the hardest to live with. His own vows anchored him like a hook in flesh. No wife, no children, no lands, no glory. But there were days when all the world felt like his responsibility because no one else wanted it. Clydas's careful old man's voice came thin against the wind. "Lord Commander?" Jon turned. In that light, the steward's face looked like a map of wintered rivers. The parchment in his hand shivered with age or cold. Jon could not tell which. Clydas held it out. "Another for Eastwatch," he said, "and one more for the Shadow Tower. Maester Harmune has penned the copies for the southern keeps as your lordship asked. 7 for the south and 7 for the west and 7 for the east, though I'd not trust the last 7 to find a warm hearth at the end of their flight." His mouth pinched with worry, and his eyes slipped past Jon to the edge of the world, where the night out past the forest was a deeper color than mere darkness. "Ravens don't seek hearths," Jon said. "They seek eyes." He took the parchment, felt the weight of it through glove and wind. The letters had been drawn larger than the maesters in Old Town would like. There were many words, old ones careful, shaped for pride to swallow without choking. Words mattered. He had learned that at Winterfell with its lessons in courtesy and silence. He had learned it on the Fist where men had died because words had not been heeded. He had learned it when he had broken bread with men who had been enemies at dawn and called them brother by night. If the wall was tired, words would have to share its burden. He rolled the parchment, slid it into the little tube, tied with a leather thong. Another tube for another raven. 7 and 7 and 7. Clydas stamped his feet. "There was a time, my lord," he said, "when our letters were little more than pleas for barley, oil, and salt. I'm not sure asking for knights and lords is easier." "It's not a request," Jon said, though he made it sound like one. "The trick was to leave other men their pride. It's a compact. We all must eat the wind together, or the wind will eat us one by one." Clydas breathed out, a cloud that burst and was gone. "A bold thing, to bind all the kingdoms to an oath." "The bold thing," Jon answered, "would be to wait until we are all dead." He glanced north again, as if he might spy silver shapes gliding between the trees. He did not. That was its own terror. Send them. When the ravens sprang into the air in a fluttered clatter of wing and bone, the dark seemed to take them. They became pellets of night spat into greater night, stars that moved, and then not even that. Jon watched until there was nothing left to watch. Ghost's ears pricked. Somewhere below, a woman laughed. A wildling woman by that sound, rough and free as ale poured over a table. "You've invited the realm into my home," said a voice like wine turned to vinegar. He knew the tone before he turned. Queen Celis Florent wore the cold like a garment she had stitched herself and chose in spite. Her furs were white as a rookery egg encrusted with frost. Red stones burned dull at her ears and throat. Behind her fluttered a handful of lords with long faces and longer noses and mouths that did not know how to smile without cutting something. Lady Melisandre trailed the queen like a second flame. She showed her teeth, which was how she smiled. "My queen," Jon said. He bowed, for she loved a bow. "The watch asks no crowns, your grace, only oaths. You ask the lords of the realm to doff their helms for another's fire," Celis said. Her breath was smoke. "You ask loyal men to stand shoulder to shoulder with traitors and wildlings. It is an indecent thing." "The realm is indecent," Jon said and smiled. A smile that cost him. "Our indecency will get us killed if it cannot be convinced to wear a uniform and dig trenches in the snow. We ask the houses to serve in rotation under watch command for a year and a day, with arms and banners, to keep the peace north of the neck, to keep the peace among the watch and to face what comes. Then another house takes its turn. The burden is shared. And who commands in truth?" Melisandre's voice was silk over coals. "A boy with snow in his name and snow in his veins? Command at the wall falls to the watch," Jon said. "Beyond titles and flames, we are the ones who know the path across the ice. If they don't trust us, they will learn or they will bleed." "The king," Celis said, and her mouth made it sound like a prayer, "will take offense if this oath is not sworn to him and in his name." "The oath is sworn to the wall and the living," Jon said. "Whoever sits a throne or calls himself smoke and salt, we will use the hands that are offered. I hope your king will see it for the mercy it is." The queen's eyes hardened. "Stannis Baratheon will take what is his." Jon breathed the cold. "Then let him take his share of the cold as well." Melisandre's eyes were coals without ash. "Storms can be summoned by a whisper," she murmured. "But storms answer only kings." She tipped her head, and the light ran over her throat. "Still, it amuses me, Lord Snow, that you would call the realm to a vigil in your sullen tower. It tastes of destiny." "Destiny tastes like boiled leather," Jon said. "If I have my way, it will taste like soup." Celis' mouth twitched in something that might have been the ghost of amusement or the spasm of a muscle. "You have written to them all?" she asked. "To those who wear the lion and the golden rose and the spear sun?" "To all," Jon said. "I wrote to the great houses and to the lesser who still have stones to sleep under. I have asked each kingdom to send sworn men with names and banners for a year's service by their turn. If we are to have peace, let it begin at the only place where it has ever meant anything." "Peace is a word crows use when they want seed," said a voice as broad as a gate swung wide. Tormund Giantsbane climbed the last of the ice steps and came upon them like a storm blowing in. His hair was badger pelt and his beard was bigger. He slapped Jon on the back with a hand like a shovel. "But I'll say this. A man who calls half the world to sleep in the snow and piss in a hole has a stiffer cock than a king." The queen flinched as if Tormund had thrown something wet. "Take your savage away," she hissed to no one in particular. "Your stink makes the air curdle." Tormund bent at the waist in a parody of a bow that made the ice around them creak. "Your grace," he boomed. "I would kiss your hand if I could find it under all them dead rabbits." Jon didn't laugh. "Go down," he said. "Tell the free folk we'll need fires kept all night, and a hall for guests who won't know a tree nail from a vent hole. And no fighting, not even with your mouths." Tormund scratched at his beard. "No fighting with our mouths? What good's a mouth, then?" "Eating," Jon said, "and swearing, maybe even singing." Tormund's eyes gleamed. "I know a song or two." "Not those songs," Jon said. "The Southrons frighten easily." Tormund hooted and clomped away. his laughter a warm thing that scattered the cold for a heartbeat. Celis gathered her furs like armor. Melisandre watched the place where the wildling had been as if something invisible had passed through the air he had warmed. "The fire is thirsty," she said softly. "It would be pleased by so many oaths." Jon looked west. The sky there had paled to a blue he knew meant no true dawn. The wind smelled of snow again. "We will be ready," he said. He said it to the queen and the priestess and the wolf and the wall and to himself most of all. It was a day measured more by the shifting of shadows than the passage of sun. Men moved like black dots in the courtyards below, hauling wood, hauling hay, heaving doors off hinges that had gone sap-brittle years ago and laying them flat as tables for the feast that was not a feast. There would be oat bread heavy with seeds and dried cherries like dark eyes, and smoked fish hauled all the way from Eastwatch and hard white cheese that held the memory of fields under summer suns no one here had seen in years. There would be ale and wine, some of it decent, some of it sour enough to strip the tongue. It would be enough. For men who had come to snarling blows over buttons and boots a month past, the work went well. Perhaps they were too cold to quarrel. Toward evening, the first horns wailed from the long wooden gallery where the lookouts sat with scarves drawn over their mouths. The sound rolled down the wall like thunder and crawled across the yard like a cat testing meat. Men looked up. Jon felt a prickle along his spine that had nothing to do with cold. Ghosts' hackles rose. Silver flashed at the treeline. Then bronze glimmered and steel. Then a long ribbon of color and men stepped from the black of the pines as if a painter had dragged new life onto a blank. The veil came first. The knights had their affronted posture, and their horses steamed. Bronze-gleamed Royce men crunched across snow that had learned to move aside for such boots. Their banners showed the moon and falcon of House Arryn and smaller devices Jon barely remembered from his reading. Red mountains on pale blue, little white bells on black, a hawk that seemed to try to fly off the cloth. They moved with the care of men stepping into another man's house whom they greatly suspected of keeping dogs. "Bronze Yon himself," said Donal Noye would have said, if he'd been alive to say it. Jon only nodded. He could pick Yon Royce from a field of twice as many men. The older man's bronze scales caught what light there was and made him look like a statue that had learned to move. His face was a cliff with good grass above it. The second horn called a deeper sound. From the east came a procession of shaggy hill ponies and men armored in patience. Dorne, Jon thought, with the same surprise every man at Castle Black wore on his face. The Dornish had come in oranges and reds that glared against the snow like summer flowers insisting upon themselves. Their mail peeped in silver and brown, practical and travel-worn. Spears rode in their hands as easily as words ride in a practiced liar's mouth. Dark eyes peered from scarves drawn high. "One of the Santagars," Clydas whispered, coming to Jon's elbow as if the names might blow away. "And that might be a Dalt. The oranges on green, and is that a Dane? Gods, a star on purple, though not the bright sword. A man can see for himself why no man from such places would willingly come so far north. But they have come. They had come." In the Dornish train walked a half-dozen women with knives on their belts the same as the men, cords in their hair, their cheeks striped with the wind. One of them grinned up at a knight of the watch who had the pale blue tears of a winter chill at the corners of his eyes and whose mouth forgot to grin back because he had swallowed his tongue. "Keep your wits," Jon said. By the time the third horn ended, snow had begun, a dry sift like flour. The third horn meant more men, Westerlands, the banners a wash of red and gold that made the eyes wince, and the smell of copper and arrogance came in equal measures. The lion looked at the falcon as a cat looks at a bird, and the bird looked at the lion as a bird looks at a cat, which is to say it pretended very hard never to have heard of cats. The men under the lion's cloth had the veil's posture without the veil's apology. "House Leford," murmured Clydas, as if Jon were taking an exam and he might whisper answers. "And those look like green fields. The Marbrands sent Adam once upon a time to raid the Riverlands. They sent him again this time to cross half a realm to freeze. Brave or foolish, it's a thin difference at the edge of the world. The Reach came like a spill of summer wine after them, greens and golds and whites, flowers everywhere they could be stitched and even some where they could not. settled among them like a shark in a school of glittering fish, a high tower ringed in silver and chalk white. The Tyrell banner did not come, but many of their bannermen did. Their horses pranced. Some of them had never seen snow that did not melt by mid-morning. A young knight with rose petals on his surcoat lifted his visor at the wind's first slap and blinked until the tears froze and made him close it again. His squire had to beat the visor down with his mitten. Men laughed. Fights had started over less. From the west, through the taller pines, trudged a black shape with a quiver of little banners like knives in its back. It moved more slowly than the others and smelled of tar and brine even before it came into the yard. The Ironborn did not bother with pretty. They were rope and leather and plain iron. They dragged their pride behind them like an anchor. A small banner that might have been a Harlaw's 10 towers dipped and then righted itself in the wind. Stormlands and Riverlands, Crownlands too. They came in knots and strings, in prides and in pairs. The fry colors intruded like mildew into a linen chest, and men spat in the snow, not because spitting would change the taste of the world, but because it was a thing a man could do with his bile. Men from the Crownlands held their banners with the careful neutrality of men prepared to say they had been nowhere near any decision that might have a consequence. So the yard filled, and the air filled with curdled courtesy, and the queen's lips grew thinner the more the world gathered in a place where her king did not sit. Melisandre slid among men like a rumor and left looks behind her that one would think were wounds. The wildlings, for their part, watched the knights dismount with the avid attention of men at a bear pit and made low bets with one another over how fast the gold ones would turn blue. Tormund presided with the joviality of a man who had discovered someone else's celebration to ruin. Jon let himself be busy. He greeted men with their names when he could and with their titles when he could not, and with my lord when neither would do. He left them their weapons with a public warning and a private understanding. He sent them to their assigned places in the long hall and the armory and the old stables that had not smelled of horse for a decade. He kept the queen's men apart where he could and close where he had to. He found places for the Dornish women without putting them where the Wintertown girls might be, because he was not blind, and because too many children had already been born of attempts to put an end to feuds with flesh. He kept the Ironborn away from the barrels of salted herring. He did not bother to keep the Freys away from anyone. There was no way to make a fry safer. The gathering had the feel of a coiled thing. Men snapped at each other in perfectly courteous words and looked at each other like men who had spent their lives learning precisely how to cut in such a way that no one would be able to say aloud that they had been cut. There were lectures about the nature of honor administered by men whose honor had been hung on hooks to dry in warmer climes. There was talk of wars as if they were the weather and talk of weather as if it were war. At dark, which came early and full of its own company, Jon had the horn sounded again, and the watch assembled a corridor of black wool for the envoys to process through. The long hall took on a glow as if someone had polished the air. Fires burned in the great hearths. The tables had been crewed a week before. Now they had cuts and scars in them that made them look like they had always been there. When the envoys entered, the mutter of voices was like the sound of a river far away. They fed the realm and the realm ate. Jon watched the first fight break out in the natural place, over bragging rights and the dryness of a Dornish wine, and sent Darius with a word and a hand to calm it. He watched a girl from Molestown slip under a table and come up beside a young lord from the Reach with cheeks like summer apples, and he sighed and said nothing, because there had always been this kind of commerce, and the watch had never policed it well. He watched Tormund lead a song whose chorus involved a bear and a maiden fair, and he slapped the table when the verse came round to the queen's men looking like beets in a garden that had been watered too long. But the lyrics were just shy of unsubtle this time, and Celis could pretend not to hear them and retain her dignity. At the high board, he spoke. He did not shout, but the room drew closer to his voice as if it smelled something it could not name. "My lords," he said, and let his gaze move from Royce to Leford to a high-tower knight whose chain shone like snake scales. "My ladies," he added, and nodded to the Dornish women who did not lower their eyes and the daughter of a poor Northman who had married herself to a then and now carried herself like the tundra. Open, hard, beautiful if you had the habit of that beauty. Winter is no longer a season. It's a visitor who will not leave. We know what that means here. Some of you have hunted in snow. Some of you have fought in it. You all have slept on it these last days. But winter is not just cold. It is hunger with teeth. It is night that forgets the way to dawn. It is a sword you cannot parry unless 3 more hands are on the hilt. You were all invited to join those hands. You call this peacekeeping, said Ser Daemon Leford in a voice that had learned its manners from Coin. His hair had that Lannister gold about it that took itself too seriously. We call it conscription. Conscription is when men are dragged to a duty, Jon said. You came because you knew you must, or because you thought you could not be seen to refuse, or because you thought you could profit by being first. All are reasons a man can wear. This is different. We ask you to bind yourselves to each other as much as to us. We ask you to make the wall a place where banners mean the same thing they mean in your own halls. We ask for a rotation, 1 year's service by each of the kingdoms in turn, sworn before gods and men, supplied by the kingdoms to feed their own, commanded by the Watch to do what the Watch knows best. Those who serve this year will be released next, save volunteers. Those who serve next will walk in these men's footprints. It divides the cost. It multiplies the strength. Peace has to be kept from someone, said Bronze Yohn in a voice like a door shutting. Who do you plan to keep peace against, Lord Commander? Free folk who are now your guests? Wolves who are now your brothers? Or some enemy whose name you won't speak because you think us children? Jon let a moment fall. Against winter, he said, and against the dead, and against your own tempers. The Night's Watch is not a law court for disputes in the Mander Valley or Red Lake. It never was and never will be. But men will sleep in one hall who last fought each other. There will be quarrels. We will give them rules, and a ring to settle them, and latrines to dig when they have no fights left in their bowels. We will give them rangers and builders and stewards to teach them what will keep them alive. We will tell them where to stand when the wind changes. You speak of the dead. Ser Dazil Dalt of Dorne flipped his spear in fingers that had doubtless learned the trick when he was 5 and bored. He did it without looking at it at all, which impressed Jon in spite of himself. We've heard tales, Northmen, but tales have always loved the distance between here and Sunspear. What you heard, Jon said, is true. He lifted his hand, and it was as if the air leaned toward it. 2 stewards carried forward a small chest they had fetched from a storehouse where the cold did half the work ice did. The chest was iron-banded, scarred, ugly. It smelled like something that had no business having a smell. Clydes's mouth went tight. Men leaned away without realizing it. Melisandre's eyes narrowed, and for once her smile was gone. Jon had them set the chest down and unbar it and open it half a finger. What lay within should have been too big for that little thing. It was not. It twitched at the scent of living breath. Men nearest it made muffled sounds. Someone swore. One of the Reach squires put his hand to his sword as if reflex had crawled out of him like a lizard and seized his fingers. He had misliked bringing it. He hated showing it as a man hates showing a scar that still aches when it rains. But men believed what they saw, and some things could be taught only by revulsion. Jon nodded to the steward. The lid closed with a grunt. The iron bar fell back with a sound like punctuation. The men released their held breaths and tried to make their faces say they had not been holding them. That, Jon said, is a hand from a woman who I watched die once and tried to die twice more. The fire kills them. Iron kills them if it is hot enough. Dragonglass will do it. Much else fails. We have learned this for you. We will learn more. He let his gaze go to the Queen without going to the Queen. We invite the Southern Lords to learn it with us. Always fire, Melisandre said. Always the red answer. Fire burns, Jon said. And ice breaks. There are no blue answers I have found that save a man. But there are answers. What followed was a thing between a debate and a hunt. Men asked questions that were really declarations. They declared things that were really questions. And some of them were too careful to speak aloud the questions that shaped their declarations. Jon had done his reading. He knew the shape of the realm's pride. He did not fault them their fear of losing it. He placed the weight of the wall where their pride might brace it. He spoke of the old compacts when the kings of winter sat their stone chairs and the night's watch was something a lord was proud to send a second son to. When the gift had fruit enough to fatten bees and the watch marched out like a black river under banners and came back thinner but not shamed. He did not speak of despair. He spoke of work. In the end, Bronze Yon rose with a careful effort that made men notice how much it cost his knees to move. "The Vale will sign such a compact," he said. "We will send a company to serve for a year and a day under watch command. We will feed them. We will rotate men so those who learn what they must may teach those who come after. We will not be the last to agree, because the last man to build a bridge gets the river's mockery for a lifetime." Leford narrowed his eyes as if counting coin. "If the Vale signs, the West will not be shamed," he said, which was the way a man said yes when he had to pretend it was a clever no. "The Reach has always kept gardens where others see only stones," said the Hightower Knight, which was their yes. The Dornish put their heads together for a moment and then Ser Dazil Dalt flicked his spear and smiled around it. "We will not leave the rest of you to tell stories about how we were too tender to brave the snow," he said. "Dorne will send its share." A fry began to speak. Hosteen, bulky as a crude statue, turned a pig's eye on Jon. "Then the crossing will." "No," said a voice as quiet and sharp as a quill. Maester Harmune had moved forward like a mouse that had remembered it had teeth. His chain clinked. "Nu, sir. A compact of the realm cannot hang from one rotten rung. The Riverlands may send men. The phrase alone will not be our measure. Let others of that kingdom name men to serve in rotation and to command in turn if they prove able." Harmune's voice went wry. "We may judge such nominations with the attention of a man who once burned his tongue and now whispers when he eats his soup." There was laughter at that, and it was the safe kind that draws breath back into a room. Hosteen reddened and then paled. A man beside him, one of the river's bastards with a smile like a trap, touched his sleeve and murmured. The phrase said nothing more that mattered for a while. Jon did not smile. He wanted to, he did not. "Then we shall draft the oath," Jon said. "And we shall bind it where bonds matter more than ink." "Where would that be?" Leford asked with a curl to his mouth. "In the cold," Jon said, "and under the eyes of trees that remember. We have a grove of 9 weirwoods. Their faces have seen more winters than any living man. We will ask their witness. If you have other gods who listen, ask them as well. We will let the gods sort us between them." "Always the old ways with you," Melisandre said, smiling her thin smile again. "You set new fires in old hearths and call it a miracle. I have known men to call mice horses when the night was deep enough. And I have known fire to burn men," Jon said, "and mice to eat grain that could have kept them from it." He looked down the table. "We will write tonight, we will swear tomorrow, and we will put men to their work the day after. There will be no idle months to rot this compact into another good memory." The Queen's mouth was white and tense, a line in ice. "You presume much." "I presume survival," Jon said. "It is stubborn of me." After the hall thinned and the singing went to darker corners and quieter vices, Jon went out into night and wind again with Ghost. He sat on the old bench by the cold yard, listened to the creak and whisper, and allowed himself the luxury of not thinking of anything for the space of 10 breaths. Then he thought about quills. He found his way to the rookery, where Clydas and Maester Harmune sat hunched over a table with papers splayed like fish. Candlelight pooled in their hollows. The words were there in their bones already. The Night's Watch had never lacked for ancient ways to say what it was and what it meant. Jon did not write it all. He shaped and negated. He added the rotation, the obligations for supply, the rules for command and for dispute. He called the thing something simple that would live in men's mouths. The piece of the wall. "You have a penchant for plain names," Harmune said, his quill scraping, his eyes bright from too much ink and too little sleep. "I have a hatred for grand names that make small things," Jon said. "Then don't make this small." The maester's voice was thinner than his chain. He dabbed sand on wet ink with a flourish that made Jon think of swords. "You must understand, my lord. This oath takes something from them. Takes the luxury of not looking north. There will be those who try to gnaw the leather straps as soon as they feel them. You'll have to show teeth. I have a wolf, Jon said. Harmune smiled down rather than up. You have a whole world of wolves. Many of them learned to wear man's faces long ago. The teeth you'll need are not on long jaws. We have rules, Jon said. We will have a ring. We will have something like a court. If men offend, they will lose their turn in the rota. If they draw blood, they will find themselves in the ice cells thinking about what happens to blood in the north. And if kings object, then kings can take up a shovel. Harmune's cool paused. You will need a seal. Jon looked up at the hooks above the table where things hung like dead birds. Old stamps with names of men whose bones were dust. A cracked seal stone with a dire wolf worn down to a shadow. A bit of wood carved with a raven that looked more like a lopsided kestrel. He took the cracked stone and turned it in his palm. Winterfell's stone, Clydas said softly. It came north with... He stopped speaking as if something had choked him. Let it serve a gain, Jon said. He set the stone down on the table with care, as if it might break farther into history if jostled. Not as Lord of Winterfell, as a son of the North. It will annoy the right people, Harmune said, and his smile reached his eyes this time. When dawn was the palest stain at the edge of the east and the pines made long black bones against it, they marched into the snow. The grove of 9 weirwoods stood in a crescent like old men with their backs to the wind and their faces to watching. Their eyes were red and sappy. Their mouths were cuts. It had always unsettled Jon that trees could have faces that never changed. A priest in the red woman's garb stood at a respectful distance with a brazier that smoked and crackled. A septon from among the queen's men muttered prayers behind chattering teeth and looked as if he wished the gods had demanded he sleep in the hall another hour. Men of many houses made a splash of color in a world bleached to bone. Some had never set foot on snow before yesterday. Now they stood in it like penitent children. Harmune read the oath. The words did not sing. They had no poetry. They lay flat and useful as spades. The peace of the wall bound each kingdom to send a company to serve at the wall under watch command for 1 year and a day, rotating in sequence through the kingdoms. It bound each lord who sent men to feed them and clothe them and furnish them with relief when their term was done. It bound each house to lay aside enmities at the wall and to resolve disputes in the ring if offenses were civil, with the watch's justice if they were deadly. It bound the watch to impartiality and to the duties that had kept men breathing here since the first stones of the first forts had been hauled up by hands that trembled from cold and hunger and stubbornness. It did not ask for love. It did not promise glory. It did not do anything but oblige. They took it in turn. Royce, gloved and grim, held out his right hand so that Harmune could prick his thumb with a needle. He pressed the blood against the parchment at the bottom where the signatures would go. He pressed it beneath the moon and falcon with a look that admitted of no jokes. Leford followed, and his drop of blood looked smaller, more contained, as if it had learned tricks in its long life in the veins of bankers and lords who had lived to be gray. The Hightower Knight's blood spread with a curiosity that made Jon stare, which was foolish. Blood is blood. Dornish blood steamed. Ironborn blood barely clotted. The Septon muttered that there should be a pledge on the 7-pointed star, and so there was a pledge on the 7-pointed star. The Red Priestess intoned words in a language the snow did not care for. The flames in her brazier licked white for a heartbeat and then slammed back into red as if shy of the watching trees. A man from the Riverlands kissed a weirwood's face. A man from Dorne spit in the snow and said his oaths while looking at the ground, which in its way was more honest. They all made their small defiant accommodations with tradition, and the oath was none the worse for them. A raven perched in the crown of one of the weirwoods and preened. Another joined it, then 3. They were fat things this year, and that was a good sign or a bad one depending on whether you were the sort who found omens in droppings as well as in blood. Harmune had them press their seals to the bottom, and the cracked Winterfell stone went clack against wax in such a way that made Jon close his eyes for half a beat. When he opened them, Melisandre was watching him as if she had discovered a thing in her soup, and he looked away on purpose. It was done. There was no lightning, no treeside. The wind went on with its endless knitting. Men drew in breaths and let them go and discovered they made little clouds in the cold. "You have your peace," Celis said, as if she had spit out something bitter. "Make what you will of it." "We will," John said. "It begins with work. Work in winter means finding a way to make idle hands busy, and then telling them their work matters until they believe it." John set the peacekeepers to the tasks he had envisioned and some he hadn't. The Vale trained with the Watch's builders to repair old stairs and build new ones with wooden treads that would not crack at the first complaint. The Dornish taught wildlings to thrust with a spear in a way that kept the man behind you alive. The Westerlands learned to run across hardpack without falling. The Reach learned to cut firewood with more than their eyes. The Ironborn found a place on the eastward ice, cutting holes and netting fish and proving to the world that any man could learn to love discipline when it had hooks. They fought. Of course they fought. A Greenfield squire called a free folk woman a goat with tits like wineskins and earned a face like meat from the North fists that followed. A Dornish woman laughed until she cried when a Marbrand knight slipped on the ice and pulled 3 other knights down with him like beads, and he took it with enough grace that she shared her bread. A Royce man took a fry by the shoulder near the granary, and told him he should wear a sign that read, "I will not take bread that is not mine," and found himself in the ring with a man who had not been in that kind of fight since he was 14. The ring did its work. So did the cold. There was murder also, or something close to it. It came as all murders do, with surprise and with familiarity wrapped around it like a scarf. On the 3rd week of the new order, a watchman found a ladder propped against the granary wall where there should have been no ladder. He climbed. At the top, he found snow pressed down with feet that had come and gone. He looked out across the yard where the men had come and gone. He saw no one. He went down with cautious feet and told Darius, who told John. John went with them and stood in the granary door and felt his stom. Ch fold. The smell had changed. Grain does not have a smell in cold. This grain had a smell. They dug, and at 3 shovels down they found a layer that had gone damp. Someone had brought snow into the granary and mixed it with grain and left it to rot. It was sabotage, and it was an old trick. He set a watch and said nothing aloud where lords could hear it. He put men to sorting the grain bag by bag. He kept his face calm. It took a day and a half to find the worst of it, and by then the rumor had walked through every hall in Castle Black. It had learned other tricks as rumors do. The Queen's men had done it. The Ironborn had done it. The Freys had done it because they had a god who loved rot. It was none of those and all of them. That night, with the torches flickering in the draft, he gathered captains from each company and set them in a circle in the old armory where the dented helms hung like ghosts. "You will each swear by your own gods," he said, "that you did not put snow in grain. You will swear that you will watch your men as if a spy sat on each man's shoulder. And I will put a man from another house in each of your storerooms, and I will rotate that man each week. If he is harmed, his captain will answer for it in chains. You will do this because hungry men abandon oaths, and because if men starve this winter, the world we are trying to build will go to the dogs, and then the dogs will starve too, and that will be that." Bronzeyone's mouth did something that might have been humor after all these years. "I have had worse arrangements," he said. "Once in Gulltown we had to share our soup with men who spat in it because a cousin of a cousin had lost a pig in a flood when my father was a boy. This is sensible in comparison." "It is an affront," said Leford. "It is the price of being warm," said John. "Which would you like?" Leford bowed because sometimes men must. John returned it because sometimes even the deserving need their dignity. "What will you do when the oath is broken?" asked Ser Dazil Dalt, whose spear never left his hand even at table. "And it will be broken. Everything men make is made to be broken. Sometimes that is how we know it is ours." "Then we will break the breakers," John said, and it came out too easy. He hoped it would be so easy when the day came. It did not take long for men to begin to lean into the peace the way they lean into any habit that protects them from thinking too much. The Ironborn who had scoffed at the ring lost a bout to a then boy with a chain scar under his ear, and then lost again, and then began to practice at night with the boy who had beaten him, and after that they were seen sitting on the same bench at supper dividing a pomegranate from a crate no one could account for. A reach man with hands soft enough to be ashamed of slipped awkwardly into ranger leathers for the first time and came back 5 days later with a face that had been carved thinner by wind. He sat quieter then, and when someone brought a jug to his table, he passed it along without counting his swallow against another man's. A Fry, miracle of miracles, went a week without lying loudly, though it was later learned he had been making up for it with quiet lies, which are an art, and one that the peace would never fully conquer. News trickled from south and east and west like water searching for flaws. There was talk of queens and queens' rivals, of kings and kings' ghosts, of a boy who wore a crown that had eaten his childhood and a girl who called herself fire and was ruining cities as if they were kindling. John listened to the news the way a man listens to rain through a roof, aware, resigned, and convinced the single leak he could fix was worth more than the flood he could not stop. He fed his men good as the stores would allow. He sent patrols carefully, and he drilled them in falling back as much as in going out. He watched his wolf, and sometimes he dreamed. In the dreams he ran, of course. He hunted, and he had a mouth full of hot iron tasting the air like a coin. Sometimes he watched a brightness moving in the woods like a small winter, and he turned away because his fur wanted to stand up and run off his skin. Once he stood over a great horn that lay half buried in snow, huge and cracked, and when he tried to dig it out, his paws bled. When he woke from that dream, dawn had not yet found a way through the shutters, and he went down to the yard and breathed the cold until the dream lay down beside his feet and went to sleep. The first rotation set out under banners that did not tug as hard as they had a month before. John did not go. He did not want to. He went anyway because a leader who does not walk a road once will never understand why some men stumble. The party was 50 men in black with a handful in colors among them to learn what mattered. A Royce knight walked in his bronze like a man inside a bell. A Dalt lifted and settled his spear like a man calming a hawk. A Lef-Ord squire tramped, his ears red beneath his cap. 2 Ironborn had been pried from the ice holes at Eastwatch with the promise of showing them a river that ran backwards. They all went north, pressed close to the wall's shadow until the trees thinned and the land rolled like a drunk to the west, and to the east stumbled toward cliffs in white. They slept as little as sense allowed. They learned when snow bearing down on a man made a different sound from mere snow. They learned to be silent as if silence were an 8th man in their file. They learned to drink through cloth while walking and to piss downwind and to think about their feet less than a man in the south thinks about his knife. They came round a low hill and found a village with a ring of ditches and sharpened stakes thick with icy beards and huts that had been built of sod and stubbornness. A fat raven watched them from a stump. John walked in with his hand on Longclaw's pommel and his eyes on the rooftops. The villa. G was dead and not dead. Pot still had grease on it. A child's carved wolf lay in the snow by a door. Tormund took that up and turned it over once and put it back where he'd found it without comment. The Ironborn traded glances that said they knew of such villages in other places, and their shame had a dullness to it that did not know how to be sharp. They found 3 bodies in a hut with a roof hole like a blind eye. The eldest was a man who had died with his right hand reaching toward a scuff in the packed earth like a handwriting. John knelt and brushed the place with his glove. There was a mark where something had been dragged and then no more mark. The trail melted. He stood. They burned the bodies with kindling gathered from huts that would never need it again and set the pot upright so the winter could fill it and crack it and be done with its kindness. Then they went on. For 6 days the world became white and pale trees and the sound of breath. On the 7th they found the tracks of something that had no warmth. John felt it in his teeth. The others had moved through this place like slight kings, leaving less trace than shadows. "How many?" asked the Royce man. "You cannot count what leaves no weight," John said. "Enough." He wanted to turn back. Enough to live was more important than enough to say you had seen a thing. But sometimes to turn back would be folly worse than going on. There were stories from wildlings who whispered about a gathering at a place of old stones where once, long before the wall learned to dream, men had called to gods not of wood. Those who heard the stories were not among the living now, but the words they lay behind had shapes. John weighed the wool of his courage. "We go on a little yet," he said. They came to an old hill with stones set like teeth around its crown. The stones were low, no higher than a man's waist. Their faces had the look of something that had learned to endure in the only way enduring had been possible. Snow had not drifted inside the circle as high as it had outside. That was odd. The wind sounded different inside the circle as well. A high thin note like a harp string plucked too hard far away. The thing that crouched in the center might once have been a man. If man meant anything beyond the strict business of birth and eating and shitting and breaking and trying not to be broken. It had no color left. The breath that came from its knot mouth did not smoke. The sword it held was as much absence as blade. John's gorge rose at how beautiful it was. He hated it for that. Beauty should never be cold, he thought, and then thought that was a child's thought, and then he moved. Longclaw met the cold blade and sang. His arms jarred to the shoulder. That strike would have broken a lesser sword and a lesser man. He let the force of it turn him, as the old bear had taught him in the yard when John had still believed the world could be learned with his feet and his muscles and not also with his heart. A spear jabbed from the side, the dalt, and the tip met blue light and hissed and cracked. "Back?" John said. Not loudly but in the voice of men who have command over their breath. "Let it come to me." He drew it away from the circle. It followed with the certainty of a thing that had no doubts, and that certainty was a kind of hunger. The Royce Knight tried a cut from the side and learned a lesson about the difference between courage and timing. Longclaw bit. The cold blade bit. Two Ironborn came in low and hamstrung nothing, which is harder to watch than hamstringing something, because it is like seeing the world refuse your knife. In the end it was iron, hot and ugly and unpoetic, laid against a neck that had no blood, that took the thing apart enough that it fell away on itself like bad ice. The pieces were lighter than they should have been. John felt he had lost something fighting it. He did not want to think what. He did not tell the men he felt it. He told them to gather wood and burn what would burn and to piss on the ash afterward and to keep their hands away from their eyes for an hour. The horn lay half-buried nearby, a great curling beast with cracks running like old rivers through it. It had a smell that reminded him of the first snowfall that year you noticed you had grown taller and the snow had not. It had a sound inside it like a hum that had not decided yet whether to be a song. Ranging men had found horns before. They had blown them and nothing had happened, and they had died in a perfectly ordinary way later like any man. He stood over this one and felt his heart beat slow and then fast. Tormund came up and spat into the snow and put his boot against the horn and shoved, and it didn't move. "Leave it," Tormund said. "I've seen a man wed because a woman smiled once when they were both 15 and do nothing but spoil it for the next 20 years. Some things you leave where you found them." John made a face. "I thought you liked big things." "I like big things I can carry," Tormund said. "You try and take that thing and you'll spend the rest of your life not carrying it and calling that a life." He scratched his beard. "Besides, if that is the horn the old songs sing about, blowing it is a fool's idea. The old songs don't warn for nothing. But if it ain't, well, then it's just a trick of the snows and we've got enough tricks already." They left it. Ghost lingered, his nose unhappily busy, and then he came at John's call with a disgusted sneer only wolves can manage. By the time they came back to Castle Black, the men had learned enough to be quiet without resenting the quiet. The peace had a new ring to it in their mouths. Not proud yet, but settled, as a ring of steel settles on a man's finger over months until he forgets he ever had skin there. It did not stop men from trying to break it. The next test came not from simple sabotage but from a letter with too much wax and too much flourish. Came with a Lannister S. Eel as large as a man's thumbnail and a hand practiced in writing things that made simple ideas look like fancy beasts. It demanded the return of certain lords who had been sent north to serve their turn. It declared that a king required them at his side, or that a regent did, or a queen mother, depending on which part of the letter you believed and how much wine the scribe had drunk by the time he got to the names. It was imperious and contradictory and smelled faintly of cologne, which should not be possible in a bit of parchment. John read it, and then he read it again, and then he took it to Harmune, and Harmune read it aloud in a voice so dry the words cracked. "The West is always like this," Harmune said. "They send you 3 sets of instructions that cannot be obeyed all at once, and then tell you that you are in error when you choose. Do you intend to laugh or to write?" "Both," John said. He drafted a reply. He thanked the Lannisters for their concern for the men in their service. He celebrated their piety. He regretted the deaths of so many over the years from cold and hunger and blade, who had not been given the privilege of such concern. He reminded them gently of the peace that had been sworn by their own envoy's hand beneath their own seal and witnessed by gods of various opinions. He told them the rotation would end at its appointed day, and that the men would then be free to go and put their necks to any yoke their lords preferred. He sent a copy of the oath, and he sealed it with the cracked stone and with the watch's plain stamp. He did not enjoy what he felt at the press of the old wolf. He only knew it felt necessary. Similarly worded nonsense arrived from a rich lord who had found himself suddenly short of cousins because of a quarrel over a vineyard whose grapes were apparently too delicious for peace. The letter suggested that the peace of the wall was a fine idea, just not now, not in such a way, perhaps in spring. The letter recommended that if the watch required men, it could recruit among the small folk of the Shield Isles exclusively. John sent a reply about seaweed and battle, and about how fish preferred to be caught where they swam, and how a ship that hoped to trade needed to sail first. The Reachman's reply came back with a small sprig of rosemary pressed in, which could have been insult or reconciliation or someone's idea of a joke. John pinned the sprig above the door to his cell and forgot it there until it turned gray and fell apart and made a mess that Clyda scolded him about. He was not ready for the murder that tried to be clever. Clever murder is worse than clumsy murder. Clumsy murder leaves you angry and sad. Clever murder leaves you ashamed you did not prevent it. Came through a fight in the ring. A Dornishman faced a left-oared man with both of them barehanded and stripped to the waist. The Dornishman danced, light, precise, beautiful, like the men of the free cities who bragged about how much their teachers charged and how little it hurt when those teachers hit them. The left-oared man moved as northern men move once they have spent a winter in the snow. Efficient. The Dornishman slipped. The left-oared man stepped in, caught the Dornishman at the neck with the meat of his forearm, and squeezed. He had not learned that in any school. He had learned it because life had tried to climb out of his throat at some point and he had pushed back. The Dornishman's face went a color that did not look like any wine John would drink. The left-oared man eased at the last moment because it was a ring and not an alley. The Dornishman exhaled and gave a small nod that said he wanted to breathe for a while and then try again later. Men laughed. Money changed hands. Someone shouted about kneading dough and someone else shouted about kneading heads. That night the left-oared man coughed in his bunk and shat himself and died. He had drunk no more than a man will drink after a bout if he thinks he may be celebrated for his loss. He had eaten no more than a man who knows he will be ribbed by his fellows if he makes a show at table. Harmune opened him with the care of a man who loved books and had learned to love other things too when the world would not be content to be written about. He found the tongue black. He found the gut narrowed in a way that meant poison born not of wildflower but of a deliberate hand. He called John quietly and showed him. He stitched the man in the old way and had the builders make a box that would burn clean. John stood and stared and made his face into a wall and thought of how many ways things die. He called captains again. He sat them in a circle again. He said, "The peace is a jealousy. It will be attacked by men who think their own peace is the only one that matters. We cannot stop men from being small, but we can punish men who are small in a large place. We will watch what goes into men's mouths. No food will go into any mouth unless it passed the eyes of two men from different houses. A man who tries to poison another will lose his hands. A man who covers for such a man will lose his turn and his place and go south with his head shaved so his lord can be ashamed to look at him. This is not a suggestion. It is a way to live. Men will hide their poison in words," said Bronze Yon. "That is their best cup. Then we will do what men do when they suspect poison," John said. "We will trade cups. We will eat the same food as the men from other houses for a month. We will sit at tables in a circle and pass plates and share cups and drink at once. We will call it whatever you wish. We will mean it to keep us alive." It worked in the way things work with men. The first night was full of awkwardness and laughter and men trying to cheat by drinking less than their share and being called on it by men who did not expect to agree with them and did. The second night was easier. The third night men began to look for their partners at table instead of the
Irkousens.
The fourth night men began to notice when a man was missing and to ask why. The fifth night a fry sat beside a Royce and did not die, though he had the look of a man disappointed by that restraint on the part of the fates. On the sixth a Dornish woman told a Reach boy who had been kissed by a Molestown girl and looked as if the sky had fallen on him to stop looking like a plucked chicken and act like a man. On the seventh the Ironborn carved a bit of wood in the shape of a fish and gave it to a then boy, and the boy looked at it like a thing he had not known men could make. Time slid the way ice slides under a man's boot when his mind is elsewhere. They met the first true storm of winter, one of those driven blankets that comes without warning and sits on a place like a bear. Men shivered in their furs and pretended they did not. The peace held. The queen's men complained as they were born to do. Melisandre smiled and watched her fire as if it spoke in a language she was too gracious to translate for the rest. Tormund told a story about a bear that rolled down a hill and grew so full of snow by the time it reached the bottom it thought it was a boulder, then fell in love with a real boulder and had little pebbles, which was either blasphemy or sense depending on a man's patience for story. The men laughed, and laughter warms for a little while. From the east came a desperate. From the west came a worse. The desperate was a handful of souls from Hardhome brought in by Cotter Pike's men, who had the look of men who had seen too much and should never have been asked to see a little more to satisfy men who had seen too little. Hardhome had been fire and smoke and screams and then nothing. The survivors had cold welded into their faces. They spoke of a cliff with a staircase that vanished under feet and a beach that had suddenly been more bone than shell. They spoke of lights out to sea and then no sea at all. They shivered when they drank warm water. They shivered when they slept. The fire made small noises and sometimes they flinched at those, and Jon hated himself for noticing. The worst was a black cloak with no man in it, blown in from the west from the Shadow Tower. It had 3 arrows in it that had snapped off and one that had stuck. It had no blood on it. It had ice. It had a smell Jon did not want to name. He stood with it in his hands and felt something like grief but older, and he folded it carefully and put it on a shelf until Harmune took it away for washing that would never make it come clean because some things were not dirty in any way you could wash from them. When the storm broke and the world was glass again, Jon called the captains and set a new kind of patrol. "We will range in mixed companies," he said. "No banner will ride out under its own alone. Black in front, black behind, colors in the middle where men can see them and remember why they do a hard thing. The Vale and Dorne together. The West with the Ironborn. The Reach with the North. If you are worried I have matched you poorly, you can bring me your temper in your mouth where we can keep an eye on it. The peace is not just an oath. It is a habit. Habits break," said Leford, because he could not help himself. "Then we will give them new ones to replace them," Jon said. "Better ones." The first of those mixed parties found a thing that became a story before it became sense. The Vale men had gone with the Dornish to the broken village at the edge of the forest. The Vale Knight had insisted on giving his cloak to a child who had no shoes because some stories about the Vale are true. A Dornish woman had laughed at him and then given her own boots to a girl because some stories about Dorne are true, too. The Royce man had offered to carry the child. The child had hissed like a cat and bitten him. The party had laughed except for the woman whose child had almost bit a knight and then had not. They had moved on, some distance into the trees, where the air was as still as old soup. They had come upon a circle of stones smaller than the one Jon had seen, and in it a sled carved with runes that had been half blurred by time and snow but that still had the flavor of the old language in them, the one no men of this age could hear without feeling their bones try to remember a dance they did not know. Upon the sled lay a man who had been a man once and who had died wearing a cloak without color. The ice on him was not right. It had formed in patterns. It had learned how to be a flower from winters long ago and had attempted to make itself a garden. The party had burned him. The flames had sat low and mean before they got their courage. Men came to the ring then by habit and by command. They stood in a circle under gray and watched 2 men step inside it. This time it was not blood calling for blood but offense calling for apology. A Reach man had called a Northman an oathbreaker because his father had fought under one banner before he had fought under another before he had died. The Northman stood and listened to the word and did not hear any of the names in the man's mouth except the last one. They agreed not to draw steel. They were made to bind their hands in cloth, as the old watch law required for such bouts, so that men remembered their hands were meant also for holding and building and did not grow too fond of breaking. The fight was short. The Northman got in close and held and whispered while he held. Later the Reachman wept into his stew and told a man beside him that the Northman had spoken a name in his ear, and it had been the name of someone he had not mourned properly. The man beside him did not understand and said so, and the Reachman did not explain, and the peace survived another night. Not all nights were like that. There was the night the Queen's men dragged Tormund into the ring for blasphemy that was also comedy, and Jon had to stand between them and discover whether being Lord Co. Mander meant he had learned how to make men obey even when one of the men wanted to die for his god and the other wanted to kill for his queen. He earned new scowls that night along with a bruised bicep from Tormund's love and fresh contempt from Celis' eyes. He counted both as wages paid for work done. There was the day Melisandre came to him in his chambers with her torch burning without smoke and said, "The storm I called is smaller than the storm that comes." Jon said, "Then put away your needle." And she smiled like a cat who has found a second bird after the first one flew. And there was the one night he woke to Ghost whining. Not whimpering, not speaking in the way wolves sometimes speak to men they love. Whining as if a tooth in the world had been pressed too hard. He got up and dressed and went out into air that sliced. The sky above the wall had torn. Strange lights moved in curtains, pale green and blue, and once a pulse of pink that made his heart jump, as if someone had touched it with warm fingers. The light hung and moved, and he realized that for the first time since he had come to the wall did not seem the most solemn thing under the sky. The wall looked like a boy holding up a shield at a tourney while giants walked past. There was a sound he had not heard before. It came from the east. It had the intimacy of something spoken to the nape of a neck and the reach of something shouted in a hall. The men on the walkway were ghosts themselves. They clutched their spears. They peered. The light made the world look like a wet painting and made it hard to see where the paint ended and the canvas began. They came up the ice like a rumor. The first of them slid where it walked and left no prints. The second looked like a man until it moved and then did not. The third carried a spear whose tip was a promise made by Winter that Winter intended to keep. Jon heard the words of the peace like a drum in his head. He did not need the words of the old vow. He knew those by heart now, and they did not help when it came time to move your feet. Bells, he said. Horns. Fire. He realized his voice was too soft and then realized he had learned how to be heard without shouting. The sound rippled down the wall anyway, a series of metal mouths complaining. Men came. Men ran. The mixed companies moved to their places, as they had drilled. As men move when the body remembers a dance the mind has not learned. A Vale man held a rope that would bring up the first of many barrels of oil. An Ironborn lit a torch. A Dornish woman checked the straps on a half-dozen clay pots and nodded as if she were telling a child she had seen him do a hard thing well and expected to see him do it again. The others did not rush. They came as if patience were a weapon. The first reached the top of the steps and had to bend to do so, which made it look for a moment absurd. Absurd things can still kill you. Jon met the thing with Longclaw and felt the old jolt. Spark-sang. He stepped aside and felt the heat of oil under his hand and prayed to gods. He did not believe were listening that the oil would catch at the right moment. It did. It caught in a sheet and ran over the edge like a veil and fell and carried death with it down to the thing that had begun to climb behind the first. A man who had trained in Old Town to make ink and kindling equally leaned over the wall with a clay pot between his hands like a baby and dropped it with a cry he bit off as if he regretted it. The pot broke on the other's shoulder and the blue light hissed and then went out the way a candle goes out when you decide to sleep instead of read. A Marbrand knight laughed like a man surprised by joy. One slipped through. It always happens. It came not up the stairs but over the side where ice had gone glassy under a day of cold sun. It moved like something that had learned to move on ice before men had learned to walk. Came at Jon's right side and he was slow because men tire. It would have taken his arm if it had been a man and not a lesson, if Ghost had not been there. The wolf struck with the precision of a thrown knife. His teeth met blue and Jon felt the shock of it in his own jaw. For a heartbeat the wolf and the other were one creature, fused by balance and hate. Then the wolf wriggled free and left Fur in something that had never learned what fur was. John swung and Longclaw sang, and the thing came apart the way ice comes apart when a river remembers it is a river again. They held. He did not know it until he heard men shouting that they had done so in voices that cracked. He did not know it until he realized he was laughing, pale and mean like a man who had gotten away with a trick that saved his life. He did not know it until he saw Bronzion take a breath like a man pulling back from a long kiss, and he realized the old knight had been in love with his fear all these years and had never told anyone and had been faithful to it. And tonight he had cheated on it with joy. They held. When the last of the others collapsed into a drift as if they had been snowmen who had remembered they were only snow, the lights drew their curtains back across the sky and the world went dark again, honest dark, and men wept and did not mind being seen. In the yard, Tormund took the hand of a queen's man and pounded it until the man begged for mercy, and then hugged him until the man begged for mercy again, and then found a cask and wept into it because there was no one left to demand mercy. At dawn the grove of 9 weirwoods seemed to lean. Perhaps they did. Perhaps the wind made them seem to. At the foot of the wall men gathered without being told to. They shouted words that made no sense and then words that did. They had no song for this. They were too cold and too new to victory. They had not been trained for joy. Celis came from her tower with her hair unbound and her mouth set as if she had been born with it that way. Melisandre moved. Behind her like a second shadow. Jon met them with Longclaw clean again and ghost scent on his hands and oil on his boots. The queen looked over the yard as if she expected it to become something else the instant she turned her head. "You have mocked kings," she said, not looking at him. "I have mocked many things," Jon said. "Sometimes that is all a man has. You were there, your grace. You saw. Men from your south fought and stood. Men from my north fought and stood. We did it under an oath we all spoke. Thank you for helping to make it so." She blinked. Melisandre's eyes were 2 rubies against pale. "It seems," she murmured, "that the old gods are jealous after all." "They are trees," Jon said. "They do not have the wit to be jealous." "They have as much wit as fire," Melisandre murmured. "More perhaps, but less vanity." The queen drew herself together. "What next, Lord Snow?" She put as much scorn into his bastard name as a woman might pack into a dowry. "Your peace is sworn. You have shown your enemies. You have blooded your dog. What next?" Jon looked south as if he could see the 7 kingdoms as something other than banners and disputes. He saw the King's Road instead. A pale stripe heading toward places where warm wine was stirred with cinnamon and girls wore flowers that did not freeze to their hair. He saw Mole's Town with its burrows and its weary commerce. He saw the gift, old and new, where fields waited stubbornly under frost for hands that would turn them when the time came. "We expand," he said. "We make the peace a habit that does not need me to remind it to breathe. We rebuild 2 more castles this winter if we can. We send 1 party to the Shadow Tower with supplies and men who have learned enough to teach. We eat, we sleep, we sharpen, we pray if we can stomach it. When spring comes, and it will, we will send south men with stories not of old oaths but of nights like last night. We will tell them if they wish those nights to continue, they need pay their share. If they wish them to end, they need pay their share twice over." "You speak like a man making a market," the queen said with a curl to her lip. "A market is the only honest war most men know," Jon said. "We have had enough dishonest ones." On that day, written down later in a book by a man who loved words and could not throw a javelin to save his life but once had given his last crust to a child in a hall where no one had noticed, the piece of the wall changed in men's mouths. It had been a promise. It became a thing like a building or a well. A well does not stop wars. It makes it harder for men to die while arguing them. It became that. In the months that followed, the rotation found its rhythm the way a new song finds its chorus. Men learned which packs rode best over a hip, how to wax bowstrings with tallow that had been kept near the hearth for a night, so it did not shatter on the string the way a man's heart shatters when he hears his father's voice in his own mouth. They learned a snow trench dug at a certain angle would not collapse even under the weight of 5 men who had eaten too much oat bread. They learned that a Dornish spear of the right height and with a tip of the right shape could slide under a White's ribs, while a Northman with an axe put iron through its spine. They learned to respect each other grudgingly, which is the only sort of respect that lasts when it has to live inside men who were not raised to give it away. Jon learned other things. He learned that Bowen Marsh could live in the same castle as his enemy and not stab him for a long time if it would embarrass him in front of other men. He learned that Satin had a touch with men who had come to the wall to forget how to be touched, and that he could make men stop shaking when firelight on a wall made them think of other fires. He learned that Val, who everyone called a princess because it had pleased Tormund to say she was, and sometimes it is easier to let men have a pretty lie when the truth is just as dangerous, had a way of standing near a frightened woman that made the woman think of mountains and made afterward possible without talking about it. He learned that Clydas would die in the rookery doing a job that would leave no songs, and he learned to put his hand on the old man's shoulder when he passed, not because Clydas needed it but because he did. He learned he could live with the cracked Winterfell stone under his hand and not break in a way anyone could see. He learned that the thing he had set in motion had already grown bigger than him, because one day he found in the yard a pair of boys from the west and the north standing toe-to-toe arguing about whether their sons would serve in the watch when their sons were old enough, forgetting for that instant that they were two kinds of men who had been taught never to stand toe-to-toe without one of them falling. They were arguing about what their sons would do together. In time, letters came tired and resigned and some even respectful. They told him men would be sent when the Rhoda demanded it. They told stories of how it was received in halls where Winter had not yet found a way to sit at table, of lords who bristled and then glanced at the way the rest of the hall watched and decided they would not be fools that day, of small folk who were proud to see the black cloaks riding with colors through their villages as if their villages were worth visiting. And there were letters that said nothing, from places where nothing had changed, and nothing may be the hardest thing to fight in the world. There were more fights with the dead. There were tragedies that made men swear they would pull down the wall with their hands rather than stand another night behind it. There were triumphs that no one sang about because men were too tired to sing. He did not keep count. You know you are a commander when you stop thinking about numbers as numbers and start thinking about them as warmth and weight. One night he found himself with Tormund in the yard again. The sky was ordinary. The world was too. It was the sort of night men will forget. And that is a shame because there are only so many nights that leave no mark. Tormund scratched himself and belched and said, "You've gone and married the realm to the wall crow." Jon smiled, which surprised him. "They were lovers long before me." "Most lovers don't like being told what to do," Tormund said. "Most lovers peel away whenever the other one farts." "We'll see," Jon said. He rubbed Ghost's ears and thought about writing to Sam. He thought about how Sam would put this down in a book with a long title and an earnest introit and how he would do it justice because that is what Sam does with words when the rest of us do with hands. "I don't know that I did the right thing," he admitted, surprising himself again with honesty's ease. "Most right things don't know they're right when they're born," Tormund said. "They're ugly and squalling and red in the face. Then they grow a bit. Then men forget what they looked like to start and swear they always wore clean linen. And if it's wrong, then we'll make another. We'll break this one into kindling and burn it and dance to keep warm." Tormund's eyes, under all that brow, were capable of tenderness that would have astonished half the world if they'd seen it. "You did a brave thing. Brave things are like eggs. Sometimes they crack and sometimes there's a bird inside. We'll see what hatches." Jon leaned back against the old bench, felt its wood cold through his cloak, and stared up into a sky that reminded him of a girl's voice that once had told him something about home. Ghost put his head in his lap and made a noise that said, "I am here and you are mine, and if you do something foolish I will see you through if I can and mourn you if I cannot." He bound the kingdoms to a shared oath. He knew better than to think it would hold forever. He knew better than to think it would keep men from being men. But he'd given the realm something to hang its weight from when the wind blew. Sometimes that is all a man can give. Sometimes it is enough. The days shortened and then lengthened again. Men traded scars and stories and tokens from places none of them would ever see and that now lived for a winter in a high cold hall. The peace of the wall developed habits of its own and a few superstitions that had the ring of truth. The East Tower was lucky for Dornishmen. A Lefford squire would never again play at dice by the West Gate. Drinking on the 7th day made a man light of foot if he had run his rounds with a full pack the day before. Never leave your boots in the yard at night because sometimes boots walk on their own at the wall and you don't want yours to learn bad habits from the others. Do not tell an ironborn you like his knife if you actually do, because he will sell it to you at twice its worth and hate you for having paid. Do not tell a free folk woman you hate her because she will marry you for spite and make you love her. Do not stand too long in the grove of the 9 weirwoods at dusk because sometimes you will think a face changed and you will not be able to call yourself a liar afterwards no matter how hard you try. On one of those lengthening days, when light had the watery look of a pot left too long on the boil, a company under mixed banners came in from the snow with a litter. On it lay a man with hair white not from age but from hurt. He was breathing as if he were trying to remember how. A Dornish woman walked beside the litter and held the end of the cloak that covered the man as if the weight of the cloth mattered. A Royce man limped. An Ironborn had lost 2 fingers and kept behaving as if he kept forgetting and then looked surprised again when he remembered. They carried the man to the warmest corner of the long hall and set him there. Jon came. The man looked up through eyes like sky water. "Lord Snow," he said in a voice that had been burned and had not forgiven the fire yet for doing it. "We met once at White Harbor, or we should have. I was the man who did not arrive." Jon stared and then he set his mouth. "Ser Davos," he said. "Or a ghost." Davos Seaworth smiled with the sort of smile men reserve for small jokes made to keep their souls soft at the corners. "Ghosts don't cough," he said. He coughed. It sounded wet and like nails being shaken in a bag. "The king sent me. The king is not dead, or he is dead, or he is winning, or he is losing. He will ask you for men." I told him there were no men to ask for. He asked me to ask anyway. I came the long way. I should have come the short. I was never wise with roads. I am wise with other things. "You're wise with oaths," Jon said, surprising himself with the heat under his ribs that made him want to attach to this man immediately and for all days. "Do you approve of mine?" "I do," Davos said, and his eyes went to the cracked wolf on its cord above the high table. "I approve of sons who try to fix what fathers could not." His voice went softer. "The world is full of broken things. If we do not try to bind them, we are like men who refuse to eat because there is no soup spoon engraved with their name." "The Queen," Jon began, "will not like that I approve," Davos said, and his smile cracked and showed the truth of it. "But she is not my queen, and you are not her man, and the wall is no throne." "That's a kind of blasphemy," Jon said. "It is the safest kind," Davos replied. "The kind that is true." He stayed. He sent messages. He learned the rhythm in a day because he was one of those men who listened faster than other men spoke. He taught a thing or two about ships to the Eastwatch men because a man who has seen the ends of the world by water cannot help teaching the shore its manners. He told Jon stories of a boy with a stag's crown that had turned out to be too heavy for his neck and of a girl with a lion's smile who had tried to eat herself, and of smuggling onions because onions are what you do when you are a man and someone asks for bread and you have none. Jon listened with his face and kept his heart still and then went outside and let it pound in the cold, which is what you do when you are a man and someone offers you love by accident. Letters grew more numerous. Food held by cunning and by luck. Men learned the taste of drippings without complaint. The dead came in their measured way, sometimes slowed by heat, sometimes faster because a fool had insisted on something a fool insists on. The piece stretched like a leather strap. Creaked. It did not snap. This is what makes a thing. Not its invention, but its refusal to break when it should. More envoys came and went. It became a sight to see. Lords and ladies in furs too rich for this world stepping onto the high platform and finding their breath taken not by the cold but by the sight of it all. To their left the world they knew, a long skein of places that collapsed distance by description and in stories, and to their right a world that did not care what they called it. They spoke their bits. They promised their shares. They also promised other things because men always bring their little baskets of future with them everywhere. "If you will support my cousin, if you will consider my claim, if you will have a care for the matter of a certain ship seized by men with too much iron and not enough manners." Jon made a habit of hearing such promises and then putting them away unkept. He was not proud of it. He was pragmatic because he could afford nothing else. In the end, the peace kept the wall and the wall kept the peace. Perhaps that is all anyone should expect of a miracle. Perhaps miracles are only the names we give to hard work after it has had time to dry and be admired. On a day when the sun truly climbed, for the first time in a long time, and men looked up at it the way you look at a friend who has been long absent and who brings bread under his arm, John walked alone to the grove. Ghost came as he always did, unasked, in case there were birds. The faces in the trees were as unreadable as ever. He stood among the roots. He thought of his father and the way duty had sat on him like a cloak that he refused to ever take off even when he lay down, which is why he had died wearing it. He thought of Robb, who had learned that it is one thing to be a king and another to be a boy who looks like a king. He thought of Rickon and Arya and Sansa and Bran and the dead and the living and the way what he had made might hold long enough for someone else to make the next thing. "Is this it?" he asked the faces. "Did I do enough?" The wind, insolent and intimate, ran fingers through his hair as if to say, "Boy, you never do enough. That is how it should be." The snow showed no prints where there were no feet. The world did not answer, which is how the world often answers. Ghost shoved his head into Jon's hand. Jon stroked the fur and felt warmth that did not come from a fire. He laughed once, surprised by it, and the laugh went up through the branches and made them look as if they had moved. He looked around, and he could have sworn, for a heartbeat, one of the carved eyes had turned to regard him with something like approval. Then it was a tree again. Back in the yard, a Dornish woman shouted at a Vale boy for not wearing his gloves and then thrust hers at him and thrust her hands in his pockets, and they both laughed like the sight of 10 summers. A Lefford squire argued with an Ironborn about the virtues of a certain type of knot and realized midway that he had begun using the other man's words as if they were his own. Tormund told a smaller man he had a big mouth and would he please continue, because it kept him warm. Clyda swore at Harmune for misplacing one of the seals, and Harmune apologized, and then confessed he had kept it in his pocket all along to be sure it did not go missing. A horn sounded in the distance, not the frantic call of alarm or the long sad song of death, but the steady, ordinary signal that marked a changing of the watch and meant men could go and warm their fingers around a cup of something that pretended it was wine. Men moved. The wall sighed. Jon stood and watched it breathe. He had bound all kingdoms to a shared oath, and for the moment, and a moment in winter is a hill of moments piled, there was peace to be kept. He would keep it until it broke, or he did. And if it did break, he would take its pieces and he would build a fire with them, and he would call men to warm their hands at it and tell them stories of what they had done. And they would mend themselves by the light of it as men have always done. And they would take up their tools and their weapons and go back to work. Ghost bumped his knee. Jon scratched him between the ears. "Come," he said. "Let's see what needs doing."